Good morning, everybody. Good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are dialing in from. I think we have a record attendance on this morning's call. Very briefly, I'm Mark Hamill. I'm the chair of YPO UK region, and delighted to welcome on this continuing podcast series our very good friends from CHX, Damien and Chris. Damien, I'll get to you guys in a minute and say a big warm hello. Just very briefly on call etiquette. Alice, our champion, Nitin, our learning officer, have been kind of integrally involved in getting this call series set up. Huge extended thanks to them. The call will be recorded, or is being recorded right now. It'll be put up on Connect, onto the YPO networks for those to access later on. The Q&A bit obviously won't for confidentiality reasons. For Q&A with Damien and Chris, we've agreed if you wanted to put questions, use the chat as you think of questions straight away, but we will be doing the Q&A session at the end. So either write them down, put them in the chat. Alice will pick them up as we approach the end of the presentation. And again, look, thanks everybody for dialing in. Amazing topic. I think it's something everybody's kind of feeling right now, particularly amongst the business leading YPO community. So look, without kind of much further ado, Chris, huge thanks. Damien, huge virtual hug to you. Thanks so much for you guys at CHX for putting the time into helping us and sharing your experience. And look, without further ado, Damien, if you want to introduce yourself, CHX, and Chris, and we'll get it rocking and rolling.
Thanks so much, Mark. It's such a huge pleasure for us to meet everyone virtually. I think the last time we met with YPO was about 2 years ago in London, and under these circumstances, it is a real pleasure to connect with anyone, never mind YPO. So CHX is an organisation, just very quickly, we specialise in what we call the biology of business. So we link mental health, performance, and culture. So those are the three areas that we really focus into. And obviously today, we're touching on mental health, but looking at it in the context of performance and drive. We usually focus in organisations at executive level, executive and senior and mid-management levels. So I think we've got the right audience here to be talking about this. And I just want to hand over to Chris. I come from business background, and I've worked in the talent space, people development for around 20 years, always my own businesses. And I formed CHX with Chris 5 years ago. He and I have worked together and been friends together for 25 years. And he is the leading expert in the link between mood, emotion, and performance. Chris is honorary professor at Kent University, a Tier 1 psychology department in the UK university sector. And he's also full-time science director for CHX. He has an enormous amount of energy, as you can imagine, doing both roles. So without further ado, I'd like to hand over to Chris, and you'll hear from both of us throughout the morning, but 90% of it will be from the brains himself. Chris, BD, over to you.
Thanks very much, Damien. Thanks very much for joining us this morning, folks. It's a pretty topical topic. A couple of things I want to make clear about this. This session has not been prepared in the context of COVID. This is a session that is broader than the current situation, but is highly relevant to the current situation. So whilst some of this will be relevant to what's happening right now, I think an awful lot of it is going to be relevant to what's going to be happening over the next sort of 18 months to 36 months as we come out of this. Some of it may apply to some of you. Then it may be that all of it applies to a smaller number of you. It's very hard to know exactly how much of the content in relation to mental health is really going to touch on an audience, so we have to keep it quite general. I also have to apologise at this stage for, of necessity, oversimplifying on many occasions an extraordinarily complex domain. So for those of you who have been personally touched by some of the issues I'm going to discuss and who may feel that perhaps I've adopted too simplistic a model, please accept my apologies for that. But again, talking to a broad audience, this isn't a clinical session. This is a sort of an awareness session at this stage. I'm very, very happy to pick up any specific discussions with any of you after this. So I'm sure Alice or Mark could forward my contact details in that in that context. So the title of this is pretty provocative, why high achievers are more, not less prone to mental illness. And it's a title that is important in the context of something that I've noticed for 25 years of working in the applied sector, in high performance sectors, from sport at one extreme through to business at the other, which is that a lot of people who are high performers, a lot of people who are successful, a lot of people who are very driven, have a set of assumptions around mental illness, and we're going to touch on those a bit later. But key amongst these is often that mental illness happens to other people. That because we, as high performers, are the select few, shall we say, almost with special powers, that the normal rules don't apply to us. So whilst we can exhibit very high levels of performance when we need to, in both, certainly in the long term, but sometimes even in the short term, this can come to a cost to our long-term performance, our quality of life, and our mental health. So what we're going to do in this module is we're going to examine the biology and the neuroscience and the psychology of the high-achieving personality, and we're going to look at some strategies to offset some of the potentially negative consequences of this overachieving personality. And I want to locate this to a degree at this stage, just before we start in your context, in the sporting context. And I think what's happened over the last 5 to 10 years in professional and elite sport is there's been a huge awareness, a huge media awareness, and very high levels of disclosure around mental illness amongst some very high performing athletes. And a lot of people have been quite surprised by this. Again, there's this assumption that, wow, we would have thought that these people were somehow immune. But sport is a very good example of a high performance domain that is in which the competitors, in which the athletes are often more rather than less prone to mental illness. And trust me that despite the high levels of disclosure that we're seeing in sport at the moment, we are only seeing the very tip of the iceberg in terms of the scale of the real problem, or the real scale of the problem. So this is what we're going to look at today. I'm going to get into this in detail a little bit later, but I want to give you a sort of quick insight in what we're going to look at. We're going to essentially look at this high achiever mental illness cycle. We're going to start off with what's called the dopaminergic personality, which can drive compulsive and obsessive behaviors. We're then going to look at excessive ambition, which can drive depression. We're going to look at how the self-image of high performers, of high achievers, can often mask symptoms of poor mental health and mental illness, and how the high achievement environment can firstly reinforce these things, but can also drive social anxiety and a number of types of anxiety. And we're going to see how these essentially are manifest in what can be very high levels of chronic stress and dysregulated mood, which themselves can very quickly become very low levels of mental health and mental illness. So in terms of some very sort of quick statistics to start off with, around 25% of people will experience a mental health problem each year. And that is a mental health problem that is more than the simple day-to-day fluctuations in mood. This is a mental health problem that requires some form of either intervention or treatment. 18% of people report experiencing a common mental health problem in any given week. Okay, now that common mental health problem may be something relatively minor. For example, waking up for 2 or 3 mornings on the trot, feeling very, very, very anxious, but not really sure why, but it could be something more serious. But this is a key statistic at the bottom. 80% of mental illness is the result of dysregulated mood or dysregulated emotion. And we're going to focus on this today because this 80% probably accounts for about 99% of the mental health problems that we see in high performance sectors. So what we're looking at here really are things like mood disorders such as depression, compulsive and obsessive behaviors, and we won't be looking at phobias in detail today, but phobias fall into this category as well. So really it's this idea that our emotions and our moods are often at the root of this particular problem, and these are fueled by certain traits that we as high achievers bring to the party, so to speak. A very, very important thing to get across as well is that a lot of mental illness is actually the result of us responding appropriately to the environment. It's odd that we tend to categorize mental illness as something that's kind of over here. It's over to the side. We've got normal, illness or health responses in the physical domain, such as our immune responses that lead to inflammation. We have pain, which is simply a neural signal. We have negative emotions. We can be anxious about a pitch, or we can be angry about a barrier, an obstacle, a conflict or something. And we tend to see these aversive responses as being quite normal, yet we see mental illness as being something that's quite abnormal. But around 80% of mental illness is simply a normal response to any of a number of specific causes. And what we're going to look at today is what we call mismatch, the mismatch between the world in which our brain evolved and the world in which our brain currently lives. And we're going to locate a lot of these problems in that particular mismatch, in that whilst the mental illness response is actually quite normal, it's still extremely unhelpful in our current environment, despite having been very helpful throughout millions of years of evolution. So this is a very, very, very simple model of the sort of classic categories of cause of mental illness. And we're probably moving from the most sort of stable and difficult to shift on the left-hand side of the screen through to the less stable and easier to deal with on the right-hand side. We're not going to look at genetics today. To a degree, we're going to look at environment today. But what we are going to really focus on is personality, is what we as high achievers bring to this particular scenario. But biology plays a major role. Life events are an absolutely critical mechanism in mental illness, but they can often feed in, they interact with things like environment and with personality. And chronic stress. Now, I think stress, I'm going to very briefly touch on how we view stress before I move forward today. We see stress as a biological response. Stress is not a cause. Stress is not something that causes the biological response. That can be anything. Stress is the biological response itself. Some people in the same situation, some people will experience high levels of biological stress. Other people will experience zero biological stress. And we can be pretty confident in saying that a very, very large percentage of the stress that is experienced on a day-to-day basis, both acute stress and chronic stress, is the result of unresolved emotions. And we can start to see how emotions, stress, and various other factors start to feed into this model that makes low mental health and mental illness more likely in certain situations. So, as I say, we're going to focus ourselves around here today, but all of these factors play a role in mental illness. Now, I'll leave you to read that when you have a bit of time. I'll summarize this in the next page. It's very important before we move on to talk about mood and emotion in the context of this discussion, that we understand what they are, because they are very, very important. We tend to think of mood and emotion as being feelings. We talk about feelings in most high performance contexts. We tend to think of feelings as being secondary to thoughts. Our cognitions, what our executive brain, what our conscious brain does, the decisions it makes, the way it processes information is often given primacy. And feelings are often relegated to a sort of second tier. But feelings are actually critical, and we're going to see why as we go through this session. And in that context, we distinguish between mood and emotion, because they both play slightly different roles in guiding our behavior, in indicating, in signaling our environment. So mood is very much about how we are feeling. We ourselves, our bodies are actually coping at any one point in time. It's a signal of current body biology. It's what we call homeostasis. The whole collection of physical processes, of biological processes that are maintaining life at any one point in time. All of these processes are mapped by the brain, and they signal the available resources to the body. So they signal critical things such as energy, fatigue, stress. Mood is affected by anything that can affect those particular variables. So mood is affected by sleep. It's affected by hunger. It's affected by a whole range of things that affect our immediate biological resources. So mood is very much about resources, our biological reserve at any one point in time. So mood is a signal really from our body to our brain. Emotion is more complex, is far more complex. Emotion is a disruption of the body's biology by signals from the environment. So to put it very simply, we perceive something in the environment. We might perceive it consciously. We might see a threat coming, but we might perceive it unconsciously. We might be aware of something subliminally or subconsciously, but not aware of it consciously. But either way, it can change our body chemistry. It prepares our body's biochemistry to deal with that thing in the environment. And the feeling of the emotion is, again, the map that the brain creates of the changes to the body. So emotions signal things that are in our environment. It signals challenge in the environment. It is significantly affected by, or significantly signals, social threats and social opportunities. So moods are about us in many respects. Emotions are about the environment. And they both played an absolutely critical role in the evolution of our health and our mental health. So if we'll take a very quick look at what dysregulated mood and emotion look like. I do apologize for the amount of text on the screen, folks. I'm never sure what sort of quality we're going to get in terms of audio on these calls. So we'd usually use far more images and less text, but I think it's quite useful to have the text today. So dysregulated mood and emotion might be quite familiar to some of us in terms of these statements about what they look like. It can be baseline level of mood is too high. We can wake up feeling angry. We can wake up feeling anxious. We can wake up feeling depressed. Sometimes we even wake up feeling too happy. And excessive happiness can be as problematic as excessive anxiety, certainly in certain situations. Baseline level of mood may be too low. But then we get into sort of more complex emotional responses. The emotional response might be deficient. For example, we may not experience sufficient anger or anxiety when we should. Or the emotional response may be excessive. We may experience too much anger or too much anxiety. The emotional response might be inappropriate in terms of the cues. So, for example, we might feel anger or anxiety at someone's success. It's something that seemed inappropriate in the context. Or the emotional response might be completely independent of cues. For example, we might feel anger or anxiety for no reason. Now, these are sort of 6 categories of dysregulated moods and emotions that often characterize about 80% of mood disorder and of mental illness. And very often it's more than one of these categories. But whilst these seem very simple and almost superficial, these can be quite pathological, particularly when they're extended over time. So we're going to move into why the brain. One of the questions I'm often asked is, if depression feels so bad and seems to have no function whatsoever, or if chronic anxiety feels so bad and seems to have no function whatsoever, how have they made it through evolution? Why were they not naturally selected out during the evolutionary process? And the reason for that is very, very simple. It's because for a significant percentage, 99.9% of our evolutionary history, these things were critical to our survival. And the absolute brutal reality of our brains in the context of the environment in which we live and work at the moment is that our brains have taken around 500 million years to evolve. We've got brain regions that were in animals that predated the dinosaurs, identical regions in many respects. Yet the world in which we operate has changed more in the last 500 years than the last 500 million, or in the 500 million years before that. So we have a Stone Age brain in a modern world. Why is this critical? Well, let's have a look at some of the physical diseases that are a result of this mismatch between how we have evolved and how our world has changed. Type 2 diabetes is largely, which is a major challenge to world health at the moment. We are now is the result of being exposed to foods that we did not evolve to eat. So we now have food technology that gives us levels of energy and types of nutrients that we simply did not evolve to deal with, and which have caused all sorts of problems for our cells. Many types of cancer are the result of being exposed to toxins that our cells cannot tolerate. Again, we didn't evolve to tolerate these these substances. Heart disease, we're now significantly less physically active than what we evolved to be. And that's critical because our cardiorespiratory systems need movement to function properly and to age properly. And in that context, mental illness sits quite comfortably. We live now in a world that our brain did not evolve to understand. So whilst we have emotion and mood responses, which for hundreds of thousands of years as humans and for hundreds of millions of years as animals that came before us as humans, were very, very helpful to us and are thus hardwired into us, they are far less helpful now, to the point where they're almost pathological now. In the same way that it was very, very helpful for our bodies to store sugar as fat throughout millions of years of evolution because sugar was rare, but it's very pathological for that now, for us to do that now, and leads to type 2 diabetes. Most of our emotion and mood responses were very helpful during evolution, but are far less helpful now. So to restate, we have a Stone Age brain in a modern world. Let's have a quick look at that brain. This is an extraordinarily crude oversimplification of the brain, but it gets the job done in many respects. And this is quite a tried and tested metaphorical model of the brain. We've got a brain region called the brainstem, which is similar to the brains of lizards and has been evolving for around 560 million years. We've got an area of the brain called the limbic system, what we might want to call the emotional brain, the mammalian brain, the brain that evolved when we started to live in codependent social groups, which has been evolving for 200 to 300 million years. And we've got this green area on the screen, the area that's called the executive brain, which has been, don't be fooled. You might be lured into thinking that's 200 million years old. No, it's not. It's around 200,000 years old. This is a beta version. This is a newcomer in evolutionary terms. But this is the part of the brain that we have conversations with. This is the conscious brain. This is the thinking brain. This is the brain that also has to regulate these two very, very powerful older brain regions. And this is part of the cause of the predisposition to mental illness that humans experience in the current environment. And we can look at these in functionally in very simple ways. The oldest part of the brain, it's like a lizard. It's all about survival. It's all about instincts. The sort of slightly newer part of the brain, the mammalian brain, is all about feeling. It's all about emotions. And the executive brain is all about thought and all about consciousness. And let's have a closer look at what they actually do. We are hardwired. These brain regions are hardwired for very specific functions. In terms of the lizard brain, it's around being vigilant to threat and ensuring immediate survival. So left to its own devices, that part of the brain, if unregulated by the emotional or the executive brain regions, would be pretty much lizard in its responses to the world. And trust me, all of us are capable of being very lizard-like in our responses, given the opportunity. The mammalian brain is all about belonging. It's all about being treated equitably and having meaning in life. Being part of a social group is what gave humans meaning. It's one of the reasons we are so passionate about being bonded to each other. It's one of the reasons why it's very difficult for us at the moment. And the executive brain is all about planning resources for future survival. And it's interesting because the executive brain, it is quite possible that humans are the only animal that is aware of the fact that there is a future. So there is a tension between the red and the yellow brain areas on the screen, which are very much about surviving here and now. The lizard brain surviving in the physical world, the emotional brain surviving in the social world, and the executive brain, which is all about surviving in the future. And some of the relevance of this will become clear as we move through this session. So let's have a look. Let's have a look at some of that hardwiring. I've said there that we're hardwired. Now, what I mean by hardwiring is that our brains have certain pathways, and that those pathways offer no real options. For any one input into that brain system, you have a pretty definitive output. So this isn't a plastic brain system that allows you to think, okay, what am I going to, here's an input here, here's a thought, where's that thought going to take me? Hardwiring means that thought takes you almost without any doubt to a specific outcome. So we can see these things, they're called pathways, and they are like pathways that go across a field of otherwise high-growing crops, a pathway that's been walked and walked and walked 1,000 times, has this lovely, lovely clear path through these high crops. It makes it very easy for the signals for people to walk that way. And this is what these pathways are. Hardwiring is about very, very low options in terms of our choices in any situation. So evolution has hardwired our brains to be a certain way. And this is critical, and it's very critical for the topic under discussion today. So one of the first critical pieces of hardwiring we need to understand is what's called the mesolimbic dopamine pathway. Dopamine as a neurotransmitter has something of a reputation. You've probably all heard of dopamine. It tends to be associated with something called reward. And the reason there's a picture of a rat on the screen there, a rat from an experiment conducted from a series of experiments conducted in the 1950s, where scientists almost by accident put an electrical probe into the brains of rats. They were looking for something else, and they found this by accident. And they found that the rats seemed to quite like it when the probe was activated, when they passed a current through that probe, when they activated this tiny area of their brain. And eventually what these scientists did is that they set up an experiment where the rats could press a lever and they could self-stimulate this particular part of their brain. And what they were expecting was that the rats would occasionally go over and self-stimulate. And what they found, pretty much to their horror, was that rats spent their whole lives pressing this lever. They were trying to press it as fast as possible, self-stimulating this particular brain region. And they didn't want to eat anymore. They didn't want to drink anymore. They didn't even want to have sex anymore. So all of the basic life requirements suddenly became secondary to pressing this lever. Because what these scientists had discovered was a critical pathway in learning. They had taught these rats a new way of stimulating an evolutionarily ancient pathway that was there to help these rats survive. And because this pathway was being stimulated at a higher level, the rats no longer needed to enact the behaviors that would normally stimulate this brain pathway. Now, we now know it as the dopamine learning pathway, really. It's more about learning than it is about reward. And we know that, for example, it is the target of most recreational drugs. Very few recreational drugs do not activate this pathway at one point in their action. So we have this idea of dopamine being something that gives us huge amounts of pleasure. When something stimulates our dopamine pathways, it makes us want to do it again. It is about learning. It's about motivation. And dopamine's effects are quite cunning. Initially, when you get a dopamine rush, you get it after the thing itself. So, for example, you might eat a bar of chocolate or have sex or take a drug or whatever, and you get that dopamine rush afterwards, and it makes you want to do it again. But the next time, you get slightly anticipatory dopamine rush, and the dopamine shifts its emphasis from being about rewarding the behavior, giving you pleasure from the behavior, to anticipating and motivating the behavior. It has taught you that this behavior was good for you, and it is now going to motivate you to want more of it. And the way it works is that the pathway gets activated, and you feel the need, the desire to enact the behavior, to keep that activation there. If you enact that behavior, you get this sense of reward, although it gets smaller each time. But if you don't, you get this sense of displeasure. You get this sense of negative emotional response, because the thing that your dopamine is telling you to do has not been enacted. Now, you might be thinking, so what? Dopamine is the absolute root of most of our obsessive behaviors. It might be something as straightforward as eating chocolate. It might be something as straightforward as exercise. And trust me, most regular exercisers I know are pretty dopaminergic about their exercise habits, in the same way as most people who eat 2 or 3 bars of chocolate a day are quite dopaminergic about their chocolate. And what we tend to find in high achievement personalities are what we call the dopaminergic personality, this dopaminergic drive, this sense of a range of behaviors which were learned very early on as being related to success, a range of behaviors that make you feel good because they were related to success, and which over time, they start to become obsessive, which means we do them a lot because we like the way they make us feel. And then they shift to being compulsive, which is we just do them all the time without even recognizing that we're doing them. They seem normal to us. So we see this shift from a normal behavior through to an obsessive behavior through to a compulsive behavior on the basis of our dopaminergic drive. Now, the dopamine system is very salient in times of uncertainty, when there's lots of new things to learn, and tends to be totally unactivated by anything that's certain. So the things in our life that are certain, and for most of us, for example, that might be our families. It might be that our families are pretty stable, certain, predictable things in our lives. Whenever we get home, they're always there. Certainly compared to a business domain, which is very uncertain and very unpredictable and very volatile. So very often it's the business context that will get our dopamine flowing, whilst the things that we can be sure of doesn't get our dopamine flowing. And this can be quite critical in driving the type of behaviors that over time can cause problems for us. Damien, I know you usually like to come in at this stage. Have you got anything you'd like to add to that? I think you're muted.
I would love to add to that if I can, just to bring it alive with a real example for the audience. We do work with one of the world's largest law firms, and we do quite a lot of work with them, particularly at the senior level. And we were brought in to work with them about a year ago, and the briefing was off the back of the ABA, the American Bar Association report into mental health in the big law sector, because the levels of depression and risk of suicide across the sector were extraordinarily high. And we were brought in by this particular organization to help them self-manage away from the cliff edge that many of their lawyers were walking towards. And this is a key area of our focus, because just to draw a picture of what it's like, you can imagine what it's like to work in a big law firm, and these young undergraduates and then graduates who have come through school with the same level of drive then take that straight into their career of choice. And the environment, as Chris has said, which is an extraordinary environment, one that creates anxiety, is one that promotes excessive work. And work then fuels the drive and addiction of these young people. And we see them get hooked on not the reward of the outputs of the work they're doing, but on the work itself. And we've seen huge rafts of organizations face into real mental health issues because of this. And it's when that dopamine response is constantly fueled and fueled by the act of work, but also the act of denial of pleasures, such as time with family, that actually starts to fuel the addiction. And this is where the problems really start to come. So we actually work in the big law sector looking at how individuals can self-manage, using mood as the regulator to let them know how they're doing biologically, but also how they use emotions together, how they can create a sense of community within the organization, because they are all in it together. But we're really interested in the culture of organizations and how in big law it is fueling that dopaminergic drive in every single individual. As leaders of businesses, as young presidents, you know what it's like to have huge drive, and it's unlikely in yourselves or in your organizations that you're facing into the kind of problems that they are in big law. But it is a risk. And if you are an organization that has a very good growth curve, if you are an organization that recruits the best graduates, when you can get them, or the best entry-level people, and you have a really reward-focused organization, or quote, perhaps sayings like "go the extra mile," This is a culture, and this is a group of people that are naturally going to thrive in moving forward and driving as hard as we can. Any organisation where that is made up of people or groups of people that thrive in that way are at risk. So I just wanted to draw that example. It's an extreme example, but data is telling us that it is a real problem now. There is enough mental health data out there in the workplace for us to know that excessive drive, leads to things like depression, anxiety, stress, mood disorders. And actually the status of being in those organizations masks many of those symptoms. So, Chris, back to you, having delivered that message of gloom about the legal sector. I hope that.
Thanks, Damien. No, it's highly relevant, and I think one of the learnings that the legal sector, I think our work with the legal sector has been interesting from two perspectives. Firstly, I think their experience is slightly more intense when it comes to mental illness. I think that's a cultural thing. I mean, something like 20% of graduates going into the legal sector have already had clinical treatment for a mental health disorder. That's people going into the sector. But also they have adopted a systematic approach to the analysis of this. And I think if similar sectors or if other sectors adopted a similar analytic approach, we'd find whilst the intensity might not be quite the same, the scale of the problem is still is going to be proportional. I think, Damien, you mentioned there a very important thing, which is that we've looked here at this sort of learnt reward idea, this idea that we acquire a set of behaviors that become self-fueling over time is kind of made worse by the idea that we then find ourselves in what clinical psychologists call entrapment. Now, that sounds like a kind of legal term, but entrapment describes a situation in which we find ourselves on a path which is very, very hard to get off, despite the fact a lot of the signals that we're receiving about our journey along that path are not necessarily indicating that we're doing the right thing. So let's take you may be wondering why there's a picture of a body on the side here. I'm going to come to that in just 1 second, because it is very relevant. Again, I mentioned earlier that moods and emotions are both about the body. Depression is a mood. Clinical depression is a dysregulated mood. And ultimately, despite the fact that we experience this in the head, they both are caused by and cause disrupted biology. There is a very pernicious feedback cycle between the brain and the body in most mood disorders. And of course, we've got to remember that the brain, whilst we tend to see the brain as being a separate entity, the brain is simply an organ of the body, albeit one that has a very personal function to us. But the brain is as dependent on the body as are the heart, the lungs, the kidneys, the liver, etc., etc. So what we find in high achievers is that status and recognition are often critical. And this isn't just status and recognition from others. This is our own perceived status and recognition of ourselves, our own value, our own self-esteem, these markers of how we view ourselves. Moods and emotions are, as we've indicated earlier, there are signals to a degree of our success and our status. Positive emotions tend to be reflected in, for example, the dopamine reward pathway and other neurotransmitter systems such as the opioid system, the endocannabinoid system, that fundamentally make us feel good. And that's rewarding. That's self-fueling. That means we tend to pursue something because we like that feeling. We've kind of discussed that in the previous slide. Negative changes, negative events tend to result in negative emotions. And one of the problems here, however, is that when we're on a very specific path, those negative emotions, which evolved to divert us. Those negative emotions evolved to say, this hasn't worked, do something different, or this is in your way, get rid of it, or this is a threat, move yourself away from this thing. If we're on a fixed path, it's very hard for those negative emotions to do their job. We feel anxious about something, even fearful about something. but we're on a path. We have to go through with that thing. And the inflexibility of those options means that very often those negative emotions, which evolve to signal, be dealt with, be addressed, and then go away, remain in place. So we find, because we are trapped in a certain environmental system, so to speak, we are trapped on a particular path, a particular ambition, a particular set of expectations about the world. We are also trapping ourselves in a negative emotional cycle. And because emotion is a feedback between brain and body, and because mood is a feedback between brain and body, we start to notice changes in those biology start to reinforce the changes in our emotion and mood responses. So we get higher biological stress responses, and that stress puts greater pressure on us. Stress makes us want to do something more urgently, not less. That's what it evolved to do. Stress is there to say, do this. Stress feels bad. Do the thing that the stress is there to signal, and you'll stop feeling stressed and you'll feel better. So stress wants to get rid of the stress. That's how stress works. So stress puts greater pressure on us to do things. And that creates higher expectations and often means we set more demanding goals. And one of the cruel ironies of depression is that when people are depressed, that the signal is telling them, you need to change your priorities. You need to wind in your goals a little bit. You're not achieving things. You need to pull back. You need to change your direction. You need to change your environment. You need to change something. This is the evolutionary signal about depression. The irony is that all too often the high achiever, rather than moderating their goals, taking a step back, often sets even more excessive goals, becomes more ambitious, almost seems to overcome the negativity of the feeling by striving for even greater success, striving for even greater status. And of course, that leads to even greater potential for dysregulated moods and emotions and greater potential for depression. We also have an issue with, and this is very, very, very true. This was true for a very, very long time until very recently in sports, certainly, and is very, very true in many business sectors. We have a self-image that can be pretty much summed up along the lines of mental illness happens to other people. Mental illness is something that happens to other people, which goes back to my opening piece, this idea that we tend to assume that whatever it is that has led us to be extraordinarily successful also bestows some form of immune capacity against some of the less desirable aspects of the mental life. So this idea that mental illness won't happen to me because look how successful I am. I can't have become this successful whilst experiencing poor mental health often pervades. But there's a very, very, very nasty lesson from business and from sport here, which is that actually poor mental health in the short term can be very, very good for performance. And the irony is, if we take, for example, sports performance psychology, if you want an athlete to perform at their absolute best, very often what you have to do is you have to turn that athlete into an obsessive, compulsive, self-interested, narcissistic human being whose only focus is their own performance in the short term. And if you're able to do that, there's a fairly good chance that you will bring the best levels of physical performance out of that athlete in the short term. But in the long term, you will find exactly the opposite. Now, in performance psychology, for a very long time, there has been a sort of twin approach to how to bring the best out of people. There has been what we call the psychological skills training approach, which is you train the brain of the person to be as good as it can be at the tasks that it needs to be for the specific success they're looking for. Or the other hand is the mental well-being approach, which is you work with that person to help them become the most balanced human being that they can be. And you perceive the pursuit of excellence in whatever domain it is as being one component of the totality of that person's life. And there's been a real tension between these two schools for a very, very long time. But what we know without question is that in the long term, and probably in 90% of cases in the short term, it's always going to be the mental well-being approach that works. Excellent performance is a function of a well-rounded human being, not a function of pathology. So this idea that mental illness happens to other people is flawed. The idea that I couldn't perform well if I wasn't mentally ill is flawed, because a lot of people manage to in the short term. There's also another factor here, which is that business leaders, successful people generally, are often expert at reframing, at reinterpreting things, at reattributing things as well. We have to be almost immune to a bit of negative information comes in. We don't just go, crikey, what am I going to do about that? It's all over. I'm going to go back to the day job, whatever it is. We say, okay, let's have a look at those facts. Let's reframe those facts and let's see what we can extract from that gives us some hope that we're going to resolve this situation. So we have a way of thinking about the world that says, let's look at the best scenario here. Let's reframe, let's counter, let's reattribute, and let's put a spin on this information that makes it positive, that gives us hope, that motivates us, that gives us some sense of purpose here. But very often we're able to turn that skill on ourselves. And an awful lot of the high performance people I've worked with have an amazing ability to be able to say, despite the fact that 9 out of 10 people I'm dealing with are saying that I'm wrong, despite the fact that people seem to react badly to me, people seem to react in a way I wouldn't expect them to, but they're all consistent. The problem lies with them and not with me. And very often what the high achiever finds it very hard to see is they find it very hard to see traits in themselves that are all too obvious to those people around them. So this idea that our self-image, this idea that I'm not the sort of person who gets mental illness, this idea that when something happens that's adverse, I reframe it in a positive way, rather than taking a good hard look at it and say, what did that actually mean? What did that actually tell me? These are quite problematic, I won't say dangerous, but they're problematic traits of the high performer in this context. And lastly, but critically, apologies for the picture of the car there, it's a bit of a cheesy image, to be honest. Social norms are absolutely critical in fueling our expectations of the world. They're absolutely critical in fueling our choices about behaviors and fueling so many aspects of our mood and emotion responses. So high achievers tend, as Damien indicated with the legal sector, high achievers very often come from high achieving backgrounds, and that background may not be a family history of high achievement, but it may well be their own personal educational background where, for example, despite coming from a relatively low achievement background, they took it upon themselves at school or at university to aspire to achieve more. So this idea of a high achieving background and the legacy of that being either family or personal and the way that drives current behavior is critical. They also tend to work in high achieving organizations, high achieving cultures, high achieving networks, and they very often socialize with other high achievers. Now, these are all very self-evident, very obvious things, and we tend to accept them without question. But there's a very critical implication of this, which is that high achievers tend to reference themselves to these groups. They reference themselves against that high achieving background. They reference themselves against those people they work with or those networks, those professional networks in which they operate. And they reference themselves against the people with whom they socialize. Now, this creates a huge amount of social pressure. Now, many people thrive on this pressure. Don't get me wrong. Everything we talked about today is a double-edged sword, because very often the things that actually allowed us to get to where we are also the things that could represent a threat. And this is the whole basis of this session. If we reference ourselves against these groups, it's all fine as long as things are going well. But also it creates an awful lot of ongoing stress. We find that an awful lot of the time, there is a low level of underlying anxiety, a low level of underlying stress, sometimes even a low level of underlying fear that we are not, that in referencing ourselves against this group, we are coming off second. And that can feed back in to all of the things we talked about today. Greater, more obsessive and compulsive behaviors, less reasonable, less achievable goals, etc., etc. So what we see is this cycle that I mentioned earlier. We have a high likelihood of dopaminergic personality in many high achievement settings, driving compulsive behaviors and obsessive behaviors. We have excessive ambition, which can drive low mood and depression. We have a self-image which can often mask or obscure or allow us at least to deny symptoms. And I certainly in two of the high performance contexts in which I've worked, probably the biggest problem in terms of mental health and mental illness wasn't people coming to me saying, this is the problem I'm experiencing, how can I deal with it? It was either a person clearly in denial about the fact their behavior was clearly indicative of a problem, or colleagues or teammates coming to me and saying, it's absolutely clear that she or he has this problem. We've spoken to them about it, and they are unable to accept that this is the case, think there's nothing wrong, and they're going to carry on as usual. We had a very sobering conversation, a very honest conversation with a client recently who indicated that when she finally broke down, as she put it, she was a very senior leader in a business. When she finally broke down, had to take a significant period of time off work, having denied for a very long period of time that anything was wrong. But she said she literally woke up one morning, was physically unable to get out of bed. And that was the point at which she had to realize that something was wrong, because she no longer functioned physically. Having not functioned mentally very well for a very long time, she had got to the point where her biology was starting to break down as well. And she took a significant period of time off and went back to work. And when she went back to work, she said to one of her colleagues, how have you coped without me? Because she was a pivotal player. And she was really shocked and really saddened when this colleague said, it's been so much easier without you. And she didn't understand at first until he explained that basically her behavior and her performance had been so poor for several months leading to that particular moment where she broke down, but that she was unable and unwilling to listen to any feedback about this during that period of time. So her breaking down, far from being a disaster for the business, as far as her colleagues were concerned, was a very positive thing for the business. And whilst, I certainly wouldn't say that that's a common story, it's certainly not an unusual story either, this idea that we are able to be in complete denial. And the high achievement environment can often drive anxiety. All of these things lead to stress and dysregulated mood. And this becomes not cyclical so much, because it's not a case of the dopaminergic personality necessarily leads to excessive ambition, but it can. It's not the case that excessive ambition necessarily distorts self-image, but it can. And what we can see is that these things, if not a cycle as such, are certainly a syndrome. They're a set of symptoms that often characterize behavior in this context. So if we look at some practicalities, it's certainly very important to recognize dopaminergic habits, the sort of things that make us feel good but aren't always helpful. A very, very unusual dopaminergic, or a habit that most people think is helpful, but which can be pathological, for example, is exercise, or certainly intense exercise, where people get an extraordinarily dopaminergic rush for going to the gym or going to the park or whatever it is and doing something excessive, that 20-minute, that 40-minute burst of maximal exercise. And they tell themselves, yeah, I need to do this. It's about fitness, it's about health, it's about energy, it's about so many things. But very often it's about the dopamine. It's about the fact that we get this sense of reward. We get the opioid system kicking in, giving us euphoria, we get the dopamine system kicking in, giving us reward. Whether it's actually helpful in regulating our energy during the day is questionable. And we often have a whole host of these habits that exist because they make us feel good or make us feel better rather than because they make us actually good, actually better. And there is a difference between the two. So a very sort of key suggestion here is that in looking at our mood, if mood is a signal of some sort of deviation from biological balance, and if emotion is a signal of something that needs attending to in the environment, to a degree, what we should be looking for is a situation where there is no signal. Most mental health conditions are some form of pervasive signal that can't or hasn't been switched off. And we call the absence of a signal contentment. And contentment is actually a very, very important state. It's this kind of absence of strong emotional responses. Culture tends to make us want to aim for happiness, but actually happiness is quite a high arousal, quite a high energy cost state, whereas contentment is something that's quite important for us, both mentally and biologically. In terms of identification of issues, sense checking the responses of others to us is very, very important, because one of the key traits, again, going back to the example I just gave you of the client we worked with recently, this idea that she was unable to realize that while she was disregarding all of the feedback she was getting from her colleagues, that feedback was consistent. The only inconsistent feedback about this scenario was the feedback that she was giving herself. So sense checking how other people are responding to you, sense checking how you're responding to other people is a very, very good way of stopping yourself going down the path of dysregulated mood. And monitoring. I've already talked about the six areas of mood and emotion. I moved those earlier in the session earlier. I thought it was more useful to have them there. But monitoring your moods is absolutely critical. Most of us, the first thing we know about being in a bad mood is when we act as the result of that bad mood. We don't know we're in an angry mood until we respond angrily to someone. We don't know we're feeling anxious until we respond in some sort of fearful or anxious way, because we are pathologically unaware of our moods, because there is so much noise in the contemporary world, noise that was never there throughout evolution. The distractions, the goals, the ambitions, the expectations, all of these things are so complex now that we rarely take time to listen to these messages that our body is sending us. Now, emotions tend to be very, very, very interrupting. We normally know when we're experiencing an emotion, but our moods are often just a little bit too subtle for us to notice until they've caused something to happen. And in many respects, that's too late. So monitoring our moods. When you get up in the morning, think, how am I actually feeling now? And just checking in with yourself several times a day, they're very, very important things to do. But this is what I'd like to leave you with. Just redefining this high achiever mental illness cycle. We take each of those components. And what can we do that might allow us to moderate the effect of these things? So in terms of the dopaminergic personality issue, find something other than business to be dopaminergic about. Now, you might think, well, what would that be? You know, it makes sense that we're dopaminergic about the things that are important to us. But as I'm going to say in the final slide of this, in 2 minutes' time, dopamine is an extraordinary molecule. It doesn't discriminate. It tends to be activated by whatever you decide is going to be important. And it's extraordinary, the range of things that dopamine can respond to, and surprising. And I'll come on to that in 60 seconds' time. Define clear life ambitions that are outside of business, because all too often in high achievement settings, nearly all of the ambitions are focused in this one narrow domain. And any change in the status in relation to that one narrow domain causes catastrophic declines in mood and in mental health. Reappraising your self-image. Are you who you think you are? Very often we think we know ourselves best. We think that we are the expert on who we are, and that everyone else out there, we're the professional on who we are, everyone else out there is the expert. Of course, the truth is often the opposite. Very often, if we are the sum of our behaviors, well, certainly that's how other people see us, and very often it's our behaviors that are critical in our lives. If we're the sum of our behaviors, other people are often better observers of our behavior than we are. So learning to reappraise ourselves by asking other people about ourselves. How did you feel when I did this? Why do you think I did this? What effect did doing that have? Becoming almost an independent expert on yourself is very critical here. If we talk about the high achieving sort of social environment, seek environments also that challenge your perception of self. Seek environments in which the high achievement self-referencing is not possible, or even more importantly, becomes entirely irrelevant. And learning how to recognize stress levels and learning how to regulate mood are critical. One of the more important functions of mood is that minor fluctuations in mood today can indicate major fluctuations in both physical and mental health in the future. And we might be talking in 2 or 3 days' time, we might be talking in 2 or 3 months' time. But it can only signal that, it can only be of use if you're able to recognize your mood states and then recognize what that mood state is responding to. What is it that I need? It might simply be I need more sleep. And the link between sleep deprivation and mental illness is absolutely extraordinary. Literally half an hour extra sleep a night. Not half an hour more time in bed, but half an hour more sleep can be the difference between good mental health and poor mental health. What is that mood telling me? What's that mood telling me about my personal ecosystem? And in terms of the idea that dopamine doesn't discriminate, dopamine tends to flow very, very, very well when we have sex, or if we like chocolate, when we eat chocolate, and the more chocolate, the more dopamine to a degree. Absolutely, when we use a drug like cocaine, it's targeting that system ruthlessly. But also, dopamine will flow when we are altruistic, when we are compassionate, when we are empathic. Because the thing about dopamine is it tends to reward anything that was good for us throughout evolution. It rewards sex because sex was good for the survival of the species. It rewards eating of chocolate because sugar and fat were rare during evolution. Cocaine simply tricks the dopamine pathway. It didn't really play a role in evolution. But altruism, empathy, all of these things, social contact can become very dopaminergic if you let yourself become aware of that. Damien, I just want to bring you in very quickly. I know we're quite close to the end of this, but your experience of sort of dopamine and altruism is quite important here.
Yeah, do we actually have time, Mark? Can I ask? Yes, I'll continue.
I think we'll slip onto Q&A afterwards. We are over time, but look, I think there's so much value in what you guys are taking us through. Let's keep it open, yeah. And then Damien, if you just trigger Alice to if we've got any questions or people in a queue.
Yeah,
that's fine.
Okay, I just think altruism is just an amazing concept at the moment, because certainly in the UK, and I imagine all of the other countries from the audience here today are experiencing the same thing, is we've got a very instinctive response from the population in the UK towards what's happening. And we're seeing a real boost in levels of altruism right through the country. Actually, most of it in the UK is focused on the health service, because the government created this genius marketing tool and purpose called Stay at Home, Protect the Health Service, Save Lives. And it's the ultimate purpose, and it's harnessed 60 million people to focus on one thing. So there's a huge burst of altruism going on. And I think we see altruism and we define it as something that is two-way, not one-way. So we work with a quadriplegic ex-athlete who we help to climb mountains at the moment, and he noticed very early on in his rehabilitation, when he couldn't move anything and was told he would never move anything, that if he helped other people and focused on helping other people in his thoughts and actions, then he responded very positively and actually recovered quicker. So it's altruism for us is about, yes, do something for someone else, but accept the fact that it makes you feel good, because it is a two-way process. And altruism is something that we can just as easily get addicted to as we can, for instance, alcohol. And at the moment, we're just living in hope that this burst of altruism through this very difficult COVID-19 period becomes a new addiction for a lot of people. They start to form new habits. And actually, off the back of this, we have this very, very different view of people around us and people who need help. And we genuinely believe that this is as much a habit we can get addicted to as sex, chocolate or cocaine in that regard.
Thanks, Damien. And just to summarise
that'll be the topic of the next call, Damien, sex, chocolate and cocaine, yeah? The great working title. Chris, last word, Chris?
I just want to thank you so much for your attention this morning, folks. I recognise that's been a lot of information to take in. As I say, I'm very happy to touch base with any of you following this. Just quickly to summarise, I don't want you to sort of go away from this thinking, crikey, I'm destined to experience mental health problems. That's not the case at all. But the reality is that we also can't go through life on the basis that we're immune to them. And we're going to see certainly over the next, hopefully it's 3 months, it could be a lot more, that there are going to be some extraordinarily difficult challenges. And I think we all need to be extra vigilant in making sure that we aren't just doing the best we can for our businesses and for our colleagues, but that we're doing the best we can for our mental health, and that we're vigilant around recognising the types of behaviours and the types of thoughts and the types of symptoms that might be making things worse. So thank you very much, folks.